Okay, here's a wild thought. What if I told you the secret to a better sex life wasn't hiding in some steamy romance novel, but in an economics textbook? Yeah, I know it sounds a little nuts, but stick with me. Because today we're going to explore how a bit of rational thinking might just be the spark you've been looking for.
We're all taught that great sex is about that magical spark, right? The chemistry, the passion, the deep connection. And sure, that's all part of it, but what if the real problem in the bedroom isn't a lack of desire, but something a lot more logical? You heard that right, economics. The very same field that helps us understand why the stock market goes up and down might just hold the key to our relationships. It turns out, the same basic principles that drive our most calculated decisions can also explain why so many of us aren't having nearly as much sex as we want to be. Now, to get our heads around this, we only need one simple economic idea. It's the whole foundation of what we can call sexonomics. And trust me, you already get this intuitively, even if you've never heard its fancy name. The negative sloping demand curve. Okay, before you start thinking this is going to be a boring lecture, let's get one thing straight. When an economist talks about the cost of sex, they're not talking about money. Nope, they're talking about everything else you have to give up to make it happen. You know, that extra 20 minutes of sleep you're craving, the energy you barely have after a crazy day, or just pushing all that stress out of your head. That's the real price. And this graph, it lays it all out perfectly. On the side, you've got the cost of sex going up. Along the bottom, the amount of sex. And look at that line. It's a clear downward slope. All this means is that the higher the cost, in time, energy, whatever, the less sex people demand. It's pretty simple, really. The harder sex is, the less you're going to have. So let's make this a little more real. On one hand, you've got couple X. For them, the cost is through the roof. It takes too much planning, they're always tired, so they're basically celibate. But then you've got couple O. They've figured out how to lower those costs. They have quickies, they're super direct about what they want, and the result? Well, let's just say they're having a lot more fun. So why does any of this matter? Well, because for pretty much every single couple in a long-term thing, life just seems to conspire to jack up the cost of being intimate. And without even noticing it, a lot of us start to drift away from being couple O and end up looking a lot more like couple X. And wow, the data really tells the story. Just look at this shift. Right at the beginning of a relationship, a massive 78% of couples say they're having sex multiple times a week. But once that honeymoon phase is over and, life happens, that number just plummets, all the way down to 28%. And here's the real kicker. It's not because people don't want it anymore. Over half of people in committed relationships, 54%, say they wish they were having more sex. So there's this huge gap between what people want and what's actually happening. So what's getting in the way? What are these costs we keep talking about? Well, they're exactly what you'd guess. The top 3 reasons people give are being too tired, just not being in the mood, and being angry at each other. Sound familiar? These are the everyday things that make the cost of sex feel way, way too high. All right, so if the problem is basically an economic one, then maybe the solution is too. This isn't about some inevitable decline you just have to accept. It's about being strategic and finding ways to lower those costs. And luckily, the source material gives us a pretty handy economic toolkit with 3 powerful strategies to do just that. So our toolkit has 3 main instruments. First up, we've got increasing transparency. Basically, stop making your partner play guessing games. Second, resetting your habits so you can break out of a rut. And third, sending clear signals, which cuts way down on the risk of miscommunication or rejection. Let's see how these actually work for real couples. First, let's meet Heidi and Jack. They were totally in love, but their sex life was just fine. The economic problem here? They were operating in what's called an opaque market. In other words, neither one of them had a clue what the other person actually wanted. And this quote from Heidi just says it all. She wasn't being honest about what she actually enjoyed because she thought she was supposed to be polite. So you've got Jack trying everything under the sun, but he's basically flying blind because the information he's getting is just wrong. So what fixed it? Pure, simple transparency. They finally just talked about it honestly, and it cleared up a misunderstanding that had been going on for years. Get this. It turns out Jack thought Heidi hated being on top, all because he moved once because he had a muscle cramp. Just talking about it lowered that cost of anxiety and guessing, and their sex life got way better fast. All right, next up are Connor and Lindsay. These two were total go-getters who used to have an amazing sex life. But then life changed. They settled down and they just fell out of the habit. They had gone from a good habit, having lots of sex, to a new bad habit of not having sex. And they got so far off track that their excuses for not having sex started to get completely ridiculous. At one point, Lindsay actually tried to blame the industrial solvents in their drinking water for their low libidos. I mean, as you can see from Connor's reaction, they were talking their sex life to death instead of just doing it.
Connor's fix was straight out of an economics playbook. He just set a clear, simple goal: have sex 3 times a week. That's it. This forced them to get over that initial hump, what an economist would call startup costs. Yeah, it felt like a chore at first, but pretty soon they reset their whole pattern and it started feeling good and natural again.
And for our last case, we have Seth and Monica, married for 36 years, and they had that classic problem, mismatched libidos. Seth was pretty much always ready to go. Monica, not so much. This creates what economists call a coordination failure. Seth had no idea if he was going to be welcomed or just shot down. And what's really kind of heartbreaking here is how high the emotional costs had gotten. Monica was doing things like baking late at night just to avoid going to bed. She even remembered a friend who would purposely wear her ugliest nightgown so her husband wouldn't initiate. These are really costly workarounds, all because they couldn't coordinate.
Their solution was so simple and so brilliant: a signal. Monica started initiating, but on her terms. If she brought a cup of tea back to bed on a Saturday morning, Seth knew it was on. This one little signal took away all the guesswork. It totally lowered the cost of rejection for him and the cost of guilt for her, just like that.
So, we've looked at demand curves, we've gone through these case studies. What's the big takeaway here? I think the beauty of looking at things this way, through an economic lens, is that it gives you a really clear, practical way to move forward.
So here it is, your toolkit, all boiled down. First, be transparent. Talk openly and stop making your partner guess what you want. Second, reset those bad habits. Set a clear, simple goal to get over that initial hump. And third, create some simple signals to solve those coordination problems and lower the emotional stakes for everybody. And that really brings us to our final thought. If lowering costs with things like transparency and clear signals can work for something as personal and complicated as sex, just think about it. What other parts of your relationship, from who does the dishes to making huge life decisions, could benefit from thinking just a little bit more like an economist?